right, we're ready for Joshua chapter 19. If you did not get the blank map, Graded Ages will have that on the back. Some batteries. We will look at that map in just a moment and try to fill that in. If not, by the time we get to the end, we're going to take some time to work through filling in some of that map. That's more just for learning where some of the tribes are located and a little geography there to help us remember some of that. So we're ready for Joshua chapter 19. Let's review where we've been and where we're going. Here's our chapters that we've covered. And by the way, I appreciate Kevin Strickland teaching for me while I was in Dixon last week. Appreciate the work he did in covering chapter 18. We're going to go back and talk about some of the principles in chapter 18. And we're going to review. We're going to pause just a moment for those on Zoom. You're about to lose me while we change batteries here just for a second. We'll be back. All right, we should be back on Zoom. All right, here's where we've been. Chapter 1 was Joshua prepares for the conquest. Chapter 2 was the spies were sent to Jericho. Chapter 3 was the crossing of the Jordan. Chapter 4 was the memorial stones, remember, in two places. And then chapter 5 was the second generation was circumcised. Then we have the beginning of the central campaign, as we've been talking about. In chapter 6, there was the taking of Jericho. There was the failure at Ai, the success at Ai in chapter 8, the victory at Ai. And then there was the treaty with the Gibeonites. And then there was the conquest of the south and then to the north. And those were the three major campaigns. In chapter 12, there was the list of the kings that were conquered by Moses and by Joshua. Chapter 13, there was the division of the land on the east side of the Jordan River. And then there was the division of the land on the west and the land that Caleb inherits at Hebron. And then in chapter 15, we looked at the division of the land on the west, the land given to Judah. Then 16, we had the land that was given to Ephraim. And then the land given to Manasseh in 17. And then last week, the land that was given to Benjamin. So let's see where we are going now. That's the chapters we've covered. This is Wiersbe's outline of the book of Joshua. We're in the last section of the claiming of the inheritance. They crossed over the river, they conquered the land, secondly, and then there's the settling into the land, that is the claiming of the inheritance. Now within that, we're in this section of the western Canaan. This is still the subpoints from Wiersbe. And as the tribal territories are assigned, there was the eastern Canaan that was assigned, then the western side, that's where we are, and we're finishing that up. Next time we'll talk about special cities, such as the priestly cities, the cities of refuge, and then this is not a criticism of God's writing here. This is historical information. But this is not the most interesting sections to talk about this tribe was in this territory, and here were the cities that were there, and this tribe was in this territory, and the cities there. And I said that to say that when we get to this admonition of chapters 23 and 24, it gets a little more exciting. And so we'll look forward to getting to 23 and chapter 24. Now here's what happens in our study tonight. The division of the land on the west, we're in that section, but we're looking at land that was given to 7 tribes, or 6 tribes, 6 of the 7 that were mentioned in chapter 18. So we have the land for Simeon and Zebulun and Issachar and Asher and Naphtali and Dan, and then there's Joshua's inheritance is given last, before the cities of refuge are mentioned. And we'll talk about the significance of that a little bit later. Now, we may wonder, if you've done some preparation and read through chapter 19, you may have wondered now, what are we going to talk about? Because basically, all these few verses here are talking about is the land given, say, to Zebulun, mentions the cities there, and that's that. And hopefully you felt sorry for me having to make a lesson out of that. But here's some things we learned from that. Number one, I'm learning this. I'm learning from this study, as well as last week's study and the week before and the week before, these basic principles. Number one, I'm learning that God does what He promises. In other words, God promised, I'm going to give you a land. But God didn't just give them a land and said, okay, there it is. I've got you across the river. Go take it. It's yours. And then they have to figure out how we're going to do this. But God's with them and bringing them in to conquer. But once they conquered the land and have it under their control, God still has work to do. And so God is leading them and dividing the land up into various tribes. Now, as we saw in last week's lesson, go back to chapter 18, and we're going to give that kind of as an introduction, as Kevin covered this last week. There were yet 7 tribes, according to verse 2, that have not received their inheritance. So here's a second thing I'm learning from these chapters, starting in 18 forward. And that is, God finishes what He starts. God finishes what He starts. How many times have you, or maybe a friend of yours, or somebody that's supposed to be doing something for you, they start well, they do well, but because of the process taking a while, they finally just taper off and quit, or maybe you tapered off and quit, and you don't finish what you said you were going to do. Or they didn't finish what they said they were going to do. If I were to ask how many of us have ever been guilty, probably all of us have to raise our hand. We've done that. We started, but we never finished. We got tired. We forgot about our promise. We forgot about the significance of the promise, but God doesn't do that. So we're going to see here that these are the territories that have already been assigned as of the end of chapter 18. We're going to come back to that in a second. But there are yet 7 tribes, or 6 tribes, 7 counting the Benjamin, which was in chapter 18. There were 7 that are yet to receive that. So what God does beginning at chapter 18 is He's going to finish what He started. There's a practical lesson to learn from that. Not only is there assurance from God, but we ought to be like God, and that is when we are given a promise and we are given a task, we ought to finish what we start. And then thirdly, I'm learning from this, particularly when we get to the tribe of Dan. I'm learning from this context that man, including God's people, especially God's people in this context, but I'm learning a very practical thing. Man, including God's people, do not fully appreciate what's given to them or the blessings that are given to them. How so? Well, we'll get to that when we get to the tribe of Dan. In fact, all the tribes do this. We'll see this in the book of Judges. That they didn't drive out the people. God gave them the land, and so God helped them conquer the land, and then God helped them settle it out and divide into territories. And so here's your tribe in your territory. This is your land. So you drive out your enemies now, and you can occupy that, and I'll be with you when you do that. Well, they don't do that. So God did what He promised, but man doesn't always fully appreciate the blessings that are given and do what he's supposed to be doing. And I'm learning that from this. So we learned some very practical stuff. So here's what we have so far. Let's go back to chapter 18 now. Kevin covered last week. You remember, if you were not here, that you need to take note at verse 2, that there yet remains among the children of Israel 7 tribes which have not yet received their inheritance. And so what was done? Well, they were to pick out some men from each tribe, and basically these were to be surveyors. They were to go out throughout the territory and survey out what was left. So if you look at this map and take Benjamin off of the list at this juncture in chapter 18, you had all these tribes. Up here you have Asher and Naphtali. None of that's been settled yet. None of that's been divided up. So they go out and survey the area and determine what's to be given to which and how much land there is. And so they draw by lot, as we have been doing thus far. And so in chapter 18 in verse 11, the first lot fell to Benjamin. And so that was given to Benjamin. Now we're ready to go further. So here's what we're going to see. We're going to see the land given to Simeon first, verses 1 to 9. And then the land for Zebulun, 10 to 16. Issachar, 17 to 23. Asher, and then Naphtali and Dan. And so we're going to quickly work through these. We're not going to take all night to do this. So let's start making our way through that, and let's start talking about the land that was given to Simeon. Now, what I want you to notice is when we get to Simeon, this won't be reflected on the bigger map of Simeon. We're coming back to this, so if you're trying to fill out your map, and I'm encouraging you to do that, just if you write something down, I'm finding if you write it down, and that causes you to remember that. So hopefully that'll help us to remember that Judah is here, Simeon is here, Issachar is there, Dan is here. And so take a look at this map. You're going to see it again if we're going to leave it, but we're not going to. We're going to give you time to fill that out. Well, here's the point I want you to see. I want you to notice that Simeon is right here in the middle of Judah. So you might go ahead and write down Simeon, and let's make our way into the case of Simeon. So let's talk about verses 1 to 9. They drew the lot, and the second lot fell to the tribe of Simeon. And what do we see in verses 1 to 9? Well, we're going to see two or three things here. First, Grady Ages, you've watched for this little block up here on all of the, one of the questions I've asked you on the back or the front, whichever of your handout, is the size of the territory, just to kind of get a mental perspective. This is approximately 38 miles east and west and 27 miles north and south. Now, that's not exact because it's not always going to be 27 all the way across, but that gives you a general perspective of how big the region of Simeon is. 38 miles by 27 miles. Now, some of the cities that you're going to see mentioned here, and all I want to do is just draw attention to these cities. And these are mentioned. We have Beersheba, which is mentioned here in our text at verse 2. Meloda, you find mentioned here at verse 2, right in the middle of the circle. You have Ziklag, which is up here toward the top, mentioned at verse 5. And Shaharahin, not sure I'm pronouncing that. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing that right, which is mentioned there. But I want to go on over to verse 9 now and talk about why Simeon is given this particular portion. Now, at verse 9, the inheritance of the children of Simeon was included in the portion of the children of Judah, for the portion of the children of Judah was too much for them. Therefore, the children of Simeon had their inheritance within the inheritance of that people. So as they surveyed, they realized that this region that had been given to Judah was quite large, in fact, larger than they needed. So Simeon's inheritance is right in the middle of that. So that doesn't necessarily show right here on this map. We noticed that a moment ago, but all around that is Judah. We're right in the middle of Judah is where Simeon is. Now, I want to go back over to Genesis 49 for a moment, and in verse 7, this seems to fulfill a promise from Genesis 49 and verse 7. One of the reasons, there's two reasons that basically are given, one in this text and the other in Joshua that we just noted. Two reasons basically why they are given this region within Judah is because Judah was too large, number one. Number two is from Genesis 49 and in verse 7, because of the case of Genesis 34. Now, we're in Genesis 49, but this refers back to Genesis 34 of how that Simeon and Levi were cruel in dealing with the case of Dinah in Genesis chapter 24. So notice at verse 5, it says, Simeon and Levi are brothers, instruments of cruelty, talking about the case and of how they had dealt with the case of Dinah in Genesis 34. And so dropping down to verse 37, cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Well, that's one of the ways in which that was done, is they were given an inheritance within another tribe, and then the Levites, of course, were given cities scattered throughout, and rather than given a region or an allotment of land within itself. So that's Simeon now, and verses 1 to 9. That's all we're going to say about Simeon. Let's move on to the next, and that is Zebulun. This is in verses 10 through verse 16. Zebulun. Now, I want to back up and get where Zebulun is in our bigger map. Let's find where Zebulun is. Zebulun is right here, just to south, kind of west of the Sea of Galilee. That's where Zebulun is. So let's go to Zebulun and see what the text says about Zebulun. This is in verses 10 to 16. Now, about the size for graded ages, and for all of us to get the perspective, about 12 miles east and west, 15 miles north and south. Kind of gives you a perspective of the region. Now, let's call out some of the cities that are mentioned here. The text is basically giving the borders of the territory, and we're not going to trace all of that, just give you some reference to some of the some of the cities. Notice at verse 11, Dabashath. Dabashath is right down in this region right here. And there is another city I wanted to call attention to at verse 13. Gath-Hepher is found at verse 13. The Gath-Hepher, or Heifer, Gath-Hepher, mentioned here. 2 Kings chapter 14, if you turn over there just quickly, 2 Kings chapter 14, and in verse 25. This is in the reign of Jeroboam the second. The text says that the word of the Lord of Israel had spoken through his servant Jonah, the prophet who was from Gath-Hepher. That's where Jonah was from, for what may be worth to us. So he was from this region of Zebulun. Notice it's in close proximity to Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is where a great contest was taking place. We'll talk more about that at another time. The verse 14 mentions Hanathon. Hanathon is right up here to the north part of the region. Hanathon is right here. Gives us kind of a perspective. I want to mention at verse 15 Bethlehem. That's not the same Bethlehem where Jesus was born. I'm not sure that's the case, but some have suggested this Bethlehem was named after the other Bethlehem. I'm not sure about the validity of that. That may be true. But now that's the region of Zebulun. More could be said about some of those cities, but don't confuse that Bethlehem there. It was one of the cities. Mount Tabor is right here. Tabor is mentioned in this context, kind of give you a perspective of what's going on in the region around. All right, let's go back to our map, our bigger map now, and let's find the next tribe we're going to talk about. Issachar, found in verses 17 to 23. Issachar in 17 to 23. So if you're marking off your map, Issachar is right here. Just below the Sea of Galilee, just right under Zebulun. That's Issachar. So let's go find Issachar in a bigger map and see what the text says about Issachar. Now, here's Issachar. Zebulun and Naphtali, and you have the Sea of Galilee right up here under the little white box. Kind of give you a perspective of what's all around. We're 22 miles east and west, 11 miles north and south approximately, to give us kind of a bearing of what's going on. We give you some idea of some of the cities that are mentioned here. Verse 18 mentions Jezreel. You often read in the Bible about the valley of Jezreel, and here is the city of Jezreel. That's mentioned at verse 18. And we have verse 19 mentions Hapharim. Hapharim is right here in the middle. In fact, some of these cities, if you have a map that places them in a little lower, more southern region, or maybe a little north, or even east or west for that matter, not all cities are we exact as to their location, at least various maps. Verse 21 mentions Remath, which is right here. Some of the other cities you may identify that I'm not going to take the time to notice. That reached all the way to Mount Tabor. We've already mentioned Tabor as part of the region of Zebulun, but here is Mount Tabor. It's mentioned here in the context. The hill of Moriah, Morah, is mentioned here in this context. Now, there were 16 cities in their villages, gets us down through verse 23. Now, I'm going to go on to Asher. Let's find Asher on our bigger map. And we have Asher, which is over here on the Mediterranean sea coast. So that's this long, elongated tribe right there. That's where it's located. You might mark that on your map. And let's go to our text and then to our map and see what we can find out about the tribe of Asher. Some notable places found in Asher. We have, for example, By the way, it's 12 miles east and west, kind of narrow, but 65 miles north and south. So not very wide, but very long, at least in comparison to some of the others. You see Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is right here in this region. That was the seat, and I said we'd come back to that. Remember in 1 Kings chapter 18, the contest with the idolatrous worshipers with Elijah, and all of that contest took place at Mount Carmel. It was right here in this region. Notice one of the cities that's mentioned at verse 29 is the city of Tyre. It was a walled kingdom within itself. We read a great deal about Tyre, prophecies concerning Tyre. In fact, in some of the prophets, there would be a prophecy not only about, say, Babylon and Egypt, but then there would be a prophecy just about the city of Tyre. It was a kingdom within itself. It had its own king. It was a walled city. And when we're preaching about evidences of the inspiration of the Scriptures, of how the Scriptures spoke and they were fulfilled exactly like God had said, the prophecies of the city of Tyre are used, and properly so. So that's a significant city. One of the cities mentioned here is Aphek, which is right in the middle of the circle. Hammon is also mentioned in our context. Beth Emek, I believe, is also mentioned in our context without drawing attention to the exact verse on that. But that's the region of Asher. Now, verse 31 says their inheritance of the tribe according to of the children of Asher according to their families. I think Kevin probably made a point about this last week. That throughout every one of these tribes that they were settled according to their families. And that seems to me to give emphasis to the importance of family. Not just that we're of this big tribe, but they were settled according to their families. Within that tribe, this family has this family, and there's emphasis on families. Let's go to the region of Naphtali. Now, let's go back to our bigger map if you're filling that out. If you're not getting those, we're going to have time toward the end to do that. We're going to have enough time. Naphtali is right here beside Asher. So again, it's north and south is a long region. And we'll give the details of that. But it's right beside the Sea of Galilee if you're marking that. That's Naphtali. All right. So let's go back to Naphtali now. And that's going to be found in verses 32 through 39 if you're keeping up with what verses. It's about 20 miles east and west, 47 miles, not quite as long as Asher. Naphtali is long at nearly 50 miles north and south. And so it was right on the coast, or right on the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Chinnereth. Chinnereth is mentioned here in our context as being one of the cities, major cities. Hazor is as being one of their cities. Notice Hamath and Chinnereth. The Sea of Galilee was also called the Sea of Tiberias. It's also called the Sea of Chinnereth because of the close approximation of that city. Hamath is mentioned in the context. Beth-Shemesh is also mentioned in iron. Here is Beth-Shemesh. Beth-Shemesh right in here, and then iron just right above that is there's two of those cities. All right. Now, let's move on to the tribe of Dan. I want to talk about the tribe of Dan because that's quite interesting in light of some things in Judges that we want to talk about. Now, there are two sections that need to be mentioned about Dan, and there's a historical point we want to make about that here in just a moment. But if you go right here, right beside Benjamin, here this little place is labeled as being Dan, and we label that to the south. Because there's also a region to the north, this little bitty sliver of a triangle between Naphtali and Manasseh, right on the Jordan River, is Dan to the north. Why is that? Well, we'll talk about that. That's what we're going to get into next. So let's notice at verses 40 to 48, the tribe of Dan, what happened with reference to Dan. This is Dan to the south now. So you've got Benjamin here, you've got Ephraim, and you've got Judah here, and this is Dan. Kind of an odd shape, about 10 miles east and west. Not if you measured from here over to the seacoast, but about 10 miles in a part of the place. But then up north and south, it's about 22 miles. Just kind of give you a general perspective of the size. Now, let's talk about these cities here and what they did, and then we'll go to the book of Judges, because I think the book of Judges gives us some insight of why the things happened at verse 47 in just a moment. So, just a couple of cities that are mentioned. Notice you have one of the cities that's mentioned here. You have Joppa that's mentioned. Zorah right here. Zorah right near the border of Judah. That's where, if I remember right, where Samson was born. I think I'm right about that. I believe that's where he was born. Joppa is mentioned. Joppa is the place where Jonah boarded the ship. Remember when he got on the ship? That's where Jonah got on his ship. And you might make a note at verse 47. We're going to come back to this. Leshem, your translation may use another name there. Leshem or Leshem. Might make a note that is, as verse 47 goes on to show, is the city of Dan. Also, there's another name that we'll give in a moment. Let me go ahead and get that. That's in the north. Laish is another name. So Leshem, Laish, and Dan's all the same city. So if you come across a reference to they conquered Dan, or they conquered Laish, or they conquered, the wording here again is Leshem or Leshem, that's the same city. But let's go back to the south. We haven't gone to the north yet. Dan was given this region to the south. So when God gave, for example, half a tribe of Manasseh, it mentions half of the tribe of Manasseh, and then there was another half tribe. I mean, the other half of that tribe settled on the other side of the Jordan. There's nothing here about half a tribe and a half a tribe. But there's two sections for Dan. How did that happen? We'll get to that. So let's notice at verse 41, the cities that are mentioned in 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, all are talking about this region of Dan. We call it Dan to the south, but just assume the north hadn't come about yet, so it was given to Dan. This was their region. They weren't really satisfied with this, apparently. And evidence of that comes in the book of Judges, that they wanted more. But there's nothing said at this juncture about them being so dissatisfied. But be that as it may, they, beginning at verse 47, and the border of the children of Dan went beyond these. So in other words, if this was the only text we had, it sounds like that in the dividing of the lots, that Joshua is leading them. This is given to Dan, and besides that, we're going to give you more land. That's not really the full story. We'll get more to that. But notice verse 47, that went beyond, because the children of Dan went up to fight against Leshem, that's the city of Dan, and they took it and struck it with the edge of the sword and took possession of it, and they dwelt in it, and they named it Dan after their father. And so this is the inheritance according to their families. Well, let's go over to the book of Judges now. And let's start with Judges chapter 1. And in verse 34. I make a marginal note for Judges 1:34. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan to the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down into the valley. Now, what am I learning from Judges 1? Well, if you have marginal notes or just scan through your text, let's start just verse 27 for an example. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of, and it starts listing the cities. Verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Zebulun did not drive out the people, nor did Asher, and nor did Naphtali. Verse 33, and you come to the tribe of Dan, what did they do? They didn't drive their people out either. Now that's why I made the point earlier, God kept his promise, God finishes what he promises and what he starts, but man doesn't appreciate the blessings that are given. Because they're given every one of these tribes, but they're not driving out all the people. And the children of Dan didn't do that either. Well, let's go to chapter 17. Now, that doesn't explain how they got to the north. All right, let's go to chapter 18 now. Chapter 17 of Judges. Now, we'll catch the details of this when we get into Judges, which we're going to start after we get through with Joshua. That's our plan, at least. And so we'll get all those details. I'm just going to get the high points. We see in chapter 17 about Micah and his mother make idols. And so we call chapter 17 Micah's idolatry. When we come to chapter 18, those of the tribe of Dan went to Micah and took a Levite and took his idols and made this Levite their priest. And they take off and they go to the north. And they're guilty of idolatry. They're guilty of following after the plan of man, not the plan of God. And what I'm trying to paint for you is not that Joshua said, oh, y'all need more land. Let me take you to the north and give you some more land. This was their effort to gain more land of their own. And so they go to the north, beginning at verse 14, and they spread out the land. And I'm not giving you every detail of this, but I'm in Judges 18, beginning at verse 14. They take 600 men, and what do? Well, they end up conquering the city. Notice beginning at verse 27, they took the things that Micah had made, that is their idols, and they come and they take the city of, notice the city, it was formerly called Laish. That was the third name I gave you. And they called it the city of Dan after their father. So in other words, that was the capturing of this city out in the north. So they took off to the north and they captured this city, Laish, and which is the same city, bitching back in our text over in the book of Joshua, chapter 19. So what I encourage you to do is make a marginal note at Joshua 19:47 that the story of how they got there is told in Joshua 18. Does that make sense? Now, and so let me kind of put this in perspective why I think Joshua 18 helps us make some sense of that. If I just read Joshua, it sounds like they received this section at the time of Joshua. I don't think so. I think they got that later over in Judges. I may be wrong about that, but that's what I'm thinking that Joshua 18 is telling us. But it's just mentioned here as a matter of historical fact that they later received that. And so when we get over to the book of Judges, it's not that, oh, they already received that city. Remember Joshua? No, Joshua didn't give it to them. And it's much like, this may not be the best illustration, but if I told you my life story of where all I've lived and what all I've done, I might say that in 1981, I lived in Louisville, Kentucky, and I went off and held my first gospel meeting at a place in Alabama, and I moved there. I moved to that place in Alabama and stayed for 4 years. Now, you'd think that sounds like I moved there in 81. I didn't move there in 81. I didn't move there till 1989. So then as I go on and tell him my life story, I come on down a few years later and I tell you I moved to Alabama. You thought, well, I thought he already moved to Alabama. No, I'm just telling you when I mentioned this city, that's where I ended up moving later. That's all I'm doing. And so that's what's happening here in Joshua 19 is this is how they ended up in the north. We're going to see how they got there over in Judges 18 for what that may be worth to us. All right, now we're not through because we have Joshua's inheritance. So I want to go back to our bigger map that we've been looking at. And so that should be complete now. I don't mean your map. We're going to have time here in just a second. We still got 5 minutes. We're going to fill that in. That's complete as far as the tribes that have been settled. That's all the tribes now. There were 7 that were lacking. Starting in chapter 18, starting with Benjamin, 6 tonight, so that makes the 7. So now the map is complete. All the tribes have got a territory. Now let's talk about Joshua's inheritance. Now, this is interesting that Joshua didn't receive his. This is the quality of a leader. Joshua did not receive his inheritance till the end. That's interesting. Leaders don't put themselves out first and say, I'm going to take mine first, and then the rest of you can get what's left. He doesn't take care of himself. He makes sure everybody else gets theirs, and now Joshua's going to get his inheritance. And so let's see where that is. So they made an end of dividing the land. So the land has been divided. The map's complete. Now, according to the word that the Lord gave him, the city he asked for, Timnath-Serah. Well, let's find that on the map. And while we're turning over there and finding that map, this is of the tribe of Ephraim. And here's Timnath-Serah. And so you have Manasseh to the north, and you have the half a tribe of Manasseh. You have Benjamin here and Dan here. And so here is the tribe of Ephraim. That's where he receives, in the mountainous region, much like Caleb had chosen. Now back to our text at verse 50. Verse 50. We do not have a record of the promise that God gave. This was apparently a promise that God gave when they went and spied out the land and brought back good report. We don't have a record of that promise. We have the fulfillment of it here, but we don't have the record of the promise. But apparently God had made a promise to them, and this is the city that he had picked out. I think that's also true of the place where, if you know different, you can correct me, but I think that's where Joshua later buried toward the end of the book. Now, I want you to notice at verse 51 as we finish this, and then we're going to fill in our mouth, and then we're going to be done. These are the inheritance which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the fathers and the tribes divided by lot at Shiloh, and so they made an end of dividing the country. And what's interesting to notice, there at this juncture at least, not saying later by the time we get to Judges, but at this juncture, there is no hint of dissatisfaction or grumbling. In other words, there's no we have no record at least of one tribe saying to another tribe, we need your land. You have a greater portion than we have, and we need what you've got. Everyone seems to be satisfied. Everybody's taking their land, and this is how it settles out. Now, we've got a couple of minutes to go yet, so let's take time. If you haven't filled out your map, let me zoom in on this, and then we'll work our way down. If you haven't filled yours out, just to kind of get our perspective of our geographical region. So let's get on this side first. You should have Manasseh, the northern tribe of Manasseh, half a tribe of Manasseh. And then we have Gad in the middle. And let's work down. And we've got Reuben in the south. So on the one side, I just took off and left that, didn't I? Here we go. You've got, on the one side, you've got Reuben, and you've got Gad and Manasseh. So let's start at the bottom down here. We have got Judah and Simeon right in the middle. Let's go to the north of that, and you should have Benjamin, and you should have Dan to the south. And then we should have Ephraim right above that. And then you should have Manasseh, half a tribe of Manasseh just above Ephraim. And then the next one up would be Issachar. And then you have Zebulun. And then all we lack is Asher, the big long one on the seacoast, Naphtali right beside it, and then that little triangle of Dan. And that fills out our map. So as we go further, we'll be talking about various tribes, or we'll talk about a city. And where was that city? Well, it was in the tribe of Issachar. So hopefully by doing this, you'll know, well, Issachar's right up here below the Sea of Galilee. Or it was in the tribe of Dan to the south. Well, that's down here just above Judah. Or it was in the tribe of Gad. Well, that's over on the other side of Jordan. So now all 12 tribes, all of the tribes have received their land. It's all been divided. So what are we doing now? What we're doing now is, starting in chapter 21, there's cities of refuge. What their purpose is and where they are, which cities they are, will identify. Then there's priestly cities that have got to be identified. They've got to all be given out. And so they're all assigned out. And then when we get through with all of that, then Joshua's ready to give a farewell address, and he does. And an address it is. And that's in chapters 23 and 24. All right, I didn't answer all the questions for the adults, but I think some of them were, where was that location? And I was just putting directions just above Judah, or right in the middle of Judah, or just south of the Sea of Galilee. Your map's going to answer those questions for you. All right, we'll stop with that. And